Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Professor Robin Bernstein. She is a history and African American Studies professor at Harvard University. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, tell us about your new book, Freeman's Challenge.
So, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, is about how prison for profit originated in the North long before the Civil War. This is surprising to a lot of people. A lot of people think that convict leasing and profit-driven incarceration began in the South, and it began after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment, as a means to re-enslave African Americans. In fact, convict leasing did emerge in the United States in the wake of slavery, but it emerged in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. It was the North, not the South, that came up with this diabolical idea that a prison should be an economic force. And when we focus too much on the South, when we focus on the period after the Civil War, what we're inadvertently doing is letting the North off the hook. So what I wanted with Freeman's Challenge was to put the North back on the hook, to tell the story of how it was the North that invented this version of incarceration. And I wanted to tell the story in an incredibly vivid way that nobody was going to forget, because we have such vivid stories of the South after the Civil War. I wanted to counterbalance that and tell the story of the North in a really vivid way. So I told the story through one person named William Freeman, who was a teenager who was incarcerated at the Auburn State Prison, which was the Northern prison that invented prison for profit. He was African American and Native American. He was 15 years old when he went into the prison, and he fought back. He fought the system at its source. And I wanted to tell the story of Freeman's life and how he challenged the original prison for profit.
So, what year was this?
This was 1846. He went into the prison in 1840. He was released from the prison in 45, and then he challenged the prison from the moment he got in there, and then he continued to challenge it after he got out.
So we'll dive into William Freeman a little bit in a minute, but I'm really curious. What was the North's justification for doing this, or were you able to trace that out?
Oh, absolutely. I was able to trace that out. The North's justification was, this is a great way to make money. That was the justification. Capitalism was its own justification. And the North was absolutely unashamed of this. This was a Northern value, saving money for the state, using state funding to stimulate the economy. This was actually New York State's personal innovation. So New York State was one of the innovators of what's called state capitalism, which is the idea that one of the principal responsibilities of a state is to stimulate its own economy. That doesn't have to be one of the primary drivers of governmental action, but that was New York's concept that emerged in the early 19th century. So the idea that a prison could be part of that a prison could be a state-funded entity that can drive the economy, that was its own justification, and it was very attractive to a whole lot of New Yorkers, especially, but not only white New Yorkers. Later on, some people decided that the prison should also have the power to redeem people, that it should help to Christianize prisoners, for example, that it should help to make prisoners better people. But that kind of reformation goal came later. The original goal was to make money and to save money.
And did this lead to the South replicating it later? Is there a connection there, or is it just kind of coincidental?
Oh, it is not a coincidence, not at all. No, the South imitated the North, and the South adapted the Northern system. So the system that was developed in Auburn, New York, was called the Auburn system, and it was a system of profit-driven incarceration. It also had some particular practices involved with that incarceration, including factory work. And the factory work was done by prisoners who received no pay whatsoever. They manufactured consumer goods that were then sold by private companies at a profit. And they also were forced to work in total silence. And this is something that is really important. The Auburn system was sometimes called the silent system. And it's very hard to take in how horrible this was. The prisoners in the Auburn State Prison were not allowed to speak at all, ever. And this is very hard to comprehend. The only time they were allowed to speak was if a guard asked them a direct question. Other than that, they were completely silent all the time. And the purpose of this was not, this was torture, of course, but the purpose was not punishment. The purpose was productivity. The purpose of the silence was to force the prisoners to work more, to work harder, and also to prevent them from organizing. So this was the Auburn system. And pretty much the minute it was instituted in Auburn, New York, which was in the late 18 teens, early 1820s, it was immediately imitated. It was imitated throughout New York. It was imitated throughout the Northeast. And it was imitated in the South and the West. So some of the best known prisons in the South and the West, for example, Parchman in the South and San Quentin in California, Angola in the South, these were prisons that were built on the Auburn system in direct imitation of Auburn, New York. They adapted the system. So whereas in the North, profit-driven prison was primarily factory-based, in the South, it became primarily agricultural, but it was an adaptation rather than an invention.
Interesting. So, how did you first kind of learn that this was going on?
Well, I came across it by accident, and I think a lot of historians come across their projects by accident. I found out about it in a footnote. I found out about William Freeman and his life in a footnote, and I was curious and I started learning more. And one of the things that I immediately learned was that Freeman had been forced to work in a profit-driven prison in New York State starting in 1840. And when I learned that, my initial response was, what? What? There was profit-driven prison in the North in 1840? How could that be? Like a lot of people, I associated profit-driven prison with the South. I also associated it with private prisons. And the Auburn State Prison was a state prison. It was a state-run, state-funded prison. So this violated a whole lot of my expectations, a whole lot of my assumptions. And that made me really curious. And what I learned was that, yes, Freeman was incarcerated at the original prison for profit, and it had been running in this way for 25 years by the time, or close to 25 years, by the time Freeman entered the prison. So once I started learning more and more, and I was just more and more surprised, I thought, well, if this history is surprising me, I bet it's going to surprise a lot of other people as well. And that's when I realized I had to write a book.
So, was it William Freeman that you ran across, and that's what led you to this? So, that's why this is centered around his story?
Yeah. I mean, I found him first, but of course, I didn't have to write the story based on him. I found him first. He led me to the prison. And then I knew that I wanted to tell the story of the prison through him. But certainly I could have gone forward and found another subject. But William Freeman was an amazing person, and a person who challenged the prison as a teenager and then later as a very young man. And there's a lot to admire in Freeman. He really had something very important to say, which is that profit-driven prison is a form of organized theft. profit-driven prison is theft disguised as justice. And once I really took in that that's what William Freeman was saying, and nobody listened to him in his lifetime, I thought, we need to listen to him now.
So tell us his story.
William Freeman was born in Auburn, New York, in the 1820s. He was part of the most prominent Black family in town. His grandparents, who were named Harry and Kate, had been enslaved, and they had been forced to build the land that would become Auburn. And the land was had recently been subjected to genocide. The Cayugas, who had lived on that land for millennia, had quite recently been forced out by Sullivan's campaign, which was ordered by General George Washington. So they had been forced out and killed. Not all of them, of course, as many of them had survived, and Cayuga are alive today. But Harry and Kate, who were enslaved, were brought to that land and forced to start developing it, forcing to start building non-Cayuga residences on that land. And while they were building white Auburn, they were also simultaneously building Black Auburn. They became the founders of the Black neighborhood in Auburn, which was called New Guinea. And then William Freeman was their grandson. So he grew up in the community that his grandparents established, and he was part of this prominent Black family in town. New Guinea was small, but it was close-knit. It was vibrant, and as the formerly enslaved New Yorkers were gradually becoming free through the process of gradual emancipation, the Black community of Auburn was becoming more stable. It was becoming free. It was establishing its own identity and moving forward in a way that was really exciting and beautiful. And they also were a very important part of the Underground Railroad. The book ends actually with Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman came to Auburn in the 1850s, and we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but she came to Auburn in the 1850s, and she settled there and knew many members of William Freeman's family. And she lived in Auburn from the 1850s until her death in 1913. So this is the community in which William Freeman grew up. He grew up under some difficult circumstances too. His father died when he was quite young. His mother had a drinking problem, and she also was a single mother of 3. So she had difficulty raising him, and he was forced to work from a very early age. But he had a good life in a lot of ways. And then everything changed in 1840. What happened in that year was that William Freeman was accused of stealing a horse. There was no evidence against him other than the accusation itself, but it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. Now, of course, he knew the prison well because he had grown up right outside of it. The Auburn State Prison was the center of town. It was the economic heart of the town. Everybody was economically tied to it in one way or another. So he knew the prison, and now he was being forced into it.
And he also, at some point, committed a murder?
He did, and that's the murder that is in the title of the book. So Freeman challenged prison for profit from the moment he entered the prison. He told the guards that he did not want to work, as he put it, for nothing. And by nothing, he meant 2 things. He meant no pay, and he also meant no crime, because he always insisted he was innocent of the horse theft. So he was resisting from the very beginning, and he was very badly beaten for it. He was whipped. He was waterboarded. The Auburn State Prison innovated a new form of waterboarding, and he was subjected to that torture. And he was also beaten over the head with a board. A guard beat him so badly that he sustained a brain injury, and he also became deafened. And when he got out of prison in 1845, he continued to challenge prison for profit. What his position was that he deserved to be paid for his work. because he was a worker. He was not an enslaved person. And the Auburn State Prison had basically enslaved him. This was a person who had been born free. This was a person whose parents had been his mother was born free, his father had been born enslaved and had become free. His grandparents had been enslaved and had become free. William Freeman had always been free, but he was enslaved in the Auburn State Prison. And he felt that as a person who was a free worker and not an enslaved person, he deserved wages. So he challenged that, and he went to magistrates. He tried legal means to recover what he saw as back pay that had been withheld from him, stolen from him. And for 6 months, he tried legal means, and he tried speaking to everybody who would listen to him about what he deserved and what he needed. And he was dismissed and he was laughed at. And then he resorted to violence.
One of the, I guess, interesting things is you're basically arguing that this is a for-profit prison based on kind of a monetary incentive. Is there a racial component to it as well?
Oh, of course there was. And race is really important to this story. So the original impetus for the prison was not racial. Now, of course, the existence of the prison was due to the genocide of the Cayugas. The prison itself was built on Cayuga land. It was built directly on what had been a Cayuga building. And so race and specifically genocide were the pre-existing factors literally on which the Auburn State Prison was built. But when it was originally built, the purpose was to make money for private industries, to make money for the state. The purpose, the original purpose, was not part of a racial agenda. The purpose was not to re-enslave Black people. The purpose was to enslave people. The purpose was to enslave people of all races for the purpose of making money for the state. So originally, it was not an inherently racist project, unless, of course, you count the fact that it was built on Cayuga land. However, the minute it was built, it immediately became put to racist uses. So the very first set of inmates in the Auburn State Prison seemed to have been all white. As far as we know, they were all white, but they didn't stay that way. The percentage of Black prisoners in particular steadily rose throughout the decades. And by the time William Freeman was incarcerated at the Auburn State Prison, about 1 in 9 prisoners were Black. So that was about 11%. And to put that in perspective, at the time, Black people represented approximately 2% of New York State. So Black people were overrepresented, and they went from being unrepresented in the prison to being overrepresented by about 4 to 5 fold. And that happened in about 25 years. And the percentage just went up, up, up. And today, the percentage of Black and brown people today, the percentage of people who are incarcerated in New York State who are either Black or brown hovers around 73%. So this has been a steady rise since William Freeman's lifetime.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is when you read back through the history, like one of the big stereotypes and one of the big, quasi justifications for slavery was, the criminality of Black people, and so you kind of see these two kind of paths evolving in tandem, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's incredibly important to William Freeman's story. And that's actually what the second half of the book is about. So the first half of the book is about the prison and how William Freeman challenged it. The second half of the book is about what happened next. And Freeman did resort to violence, as I mentioned, and he was put on trial. And the trial got very famous very fast. Part of the reason the trial got so famous so fast was that William Freeman was defended pro bono by William Henry Seward, who at the time was most famous for having been the recent past governor of New York State. Later in the future, he would become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He would also broker the purchase of Alaska. So if you've ever heard of Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska, that's William Henry Seward, who was Freeman's lawyer. The prosecutor, meanwhile, was John Van Buren, who was the son of President Martin Van Buren.
Interesting connections there.
It is amazing. So very famous people were involved in the trial, and the trial was it was disseminated nationally. The transcripts for the trial were disseminated nationally, so people were reading it all over the country, and the trial got very famous very fast. And one of the things that happened in this trial is it was a very early articulation of this racist idea that you just mentioned, of some sort of inherent, essential biological connection between Blackness and criminality. That's a racist idea that dominates in the US today, whether one is contesting it or whether one is going along with it. It's a dominant idea. Well, where did that idea come from? I'm arguing in this book that actually William Freeman's trial was a major incubator of this idea. This is one of the roots of this idea. And what I hope people will get out of reading Freeman's Challenge, one of the things I hope people will get out of reading Freeman's Challenge is actually getting to see how this idea was come up with, and how some of the people who came up with this idea were dyed-in-the-wool racists. They were absolutely pro-racist people who, were hardcore racists. And then there were other people who also came up with this idea, who were actually liberals and progressives, and who thought of themselves as being anti-racist, but in fact, they were deeply racist. And what I show is how liberals and progressives and conservatives all together, all these different kinds of white people came together to come up with this evil, racist libel of supposed Black criminality.
Very interesting. So there are a couple other strands I kind of want to tease out here. So one point, I guess, and I think this is an interesting question that my assistant came up with, is the fact that Freeman resisted this capitalist carceral system that he was forced into. But why does this then become kind of the beginning of the American concept of for-profit prisons?
Well, the concept of profit-driven incarceration predated Freeman, because it coalesced with the beginning of the Auburn State Prison. So the Auburn State Prison, it was first built in 1816, and this system of profit-driven incarceration was really fully up and operational by 1823. And that was very shortly before William Freeman was born. So what's special about Freeman is that he resisted, and that he resisted in a way that was at first ignored, but then became unignorable. And that's why the violence is so important. Before he resorted to violence, no one was listening to him. After he resorted to violence, he really scared people. And people were listening to him, although they did not want to hear what he was saying. And at that point, he became very important, because in an effort to control the terror that William Freeman unleashed, that's when white people, conservatives and liberals and progressives, came together to create some relatively new racist ideas. So that's how William Freeman fits into this longer history.
So along those lines, one of the interesting things, having read Slavery by Another Name, is that in the South, a lot of what they were doing was taking these really, really petty crimes, right? Like, vagrancy and loitering and all these kind of, you would question whether they're really crimes. And they use that to kind of lock these people back into the system. In Freeman's case, you could argue it's a more legitimate crime, especially, the murder. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the vagrancy laws that you're referring to, which you're absolutely right, that is a racist tool. Vagrancy laws were not operational in New York State at that time during William Freeman's lifetime. So this is something that came into practice later. So this was a particular formation of racism that was not a factor in this time and this place. Lots of other racist formations were factors, but not this particular one. But I think what's really important is the fact that there was no evidence against William Freeman for stealing that horse. There was nothing. There was simply the accusation itself. And Freeman had actually a very good alibi, and it made no difference whatsoever. So in a way, Freeman was arrested for what you call a legitimate crime, which is horse theft. He was arrested for larceny. On the other hand, he most certainly did not get a fair trial. And what's the difference in a way if he was accused of a horse theft with no evidence versus if he was accused of vagrancy? The end result was the same.
Yeah, and that leads to a whole other strand of issues, in the criminal legal system where, for forever basically, Black people have been falsely accused of crime, wrongly convicted of crime, and kind of convicted of fake crimes, like non-existent crimes. And so, none of this is really shocking if you know the history of the country, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that's completely true. And in Freeman's case, after he served time for the horse theft, then of course he did commit a very serious crime.
Right.
But he was never incarcerated for that crime. He was caught after the crime, and he did go to jail, and he did get put on trial. But his incarceration at the Auburn State Prison was for a crime that he always insisted he had not committed.
Yeah, and it's another phenomenon that we've seen, that people that were wrongly convicted, exonerated, have then gone out and committed real crimes. And I think part of that is the indoctrination, or I don't know what word you want to use, of the criminalization of people that are incarcerated, that they just they can't escape it even if they were innocent to begin with.
Yeah, one of the implications of William Freeman's story is that the Auburn State Prison not only was it a form of organized theft, it also was a cause of criminality, and that is absolutely the case. And this is one of the reasons we all should be questioning the prison industrial complex from the beginning to what will hopefully someday be the end.
And then, probably the last question I'll ask here is, on the 13th Amendment, which, for those not familiar, ended slavery except for people that are convicted of crimes. And, that's become a modern day issue because people can be enslaved, but more seriously, perhaps, you could argue this point, but, it allowed people, certainly in the South and in the convict leasing system, to be re-enslaved. And it seems like this issue that you've now brought up kind of feeds back into the thinking for how the 13th Amendment was crafted, right?
That's absolutely right. So one of the common misperceptions about the 13th Amendment was that it enabled a new form of slavery. So in the narrative that we've received, the Proclamation of Emancipation and the end of the Civil War ended Southern slavery. And so there had to be in the minds of racists, there had to be a new way to re-enslave African Americans, and they came up with carceral slavery. That's false. That's a false narrative. In fact, the 13th Amendment did not enable anything new to be created. What the 13th Amendment enabled was something old to continue. The 13th Amendment enabled the Auburn system, which had been in operation for, at that point, almost 50 years. The 13th Amendment enabled the Auburn system to continue, not only in New York, not only in the North, but also in the South, also in the West. So that's the correction that I hope people will take away from my book. And I hope in particular that people who read my book will really take in the individual characters who actually made these things happen. One of the things that I'm trying to do in this book is actually take the reader into the experiences and the logics of the people who made these things happen. They weren't simple monsters. A lot of them actually had very good intentions. And I think this is where the characters will resonate for a lot of people. A lot of people might recognize some people they know in the contemporary moment. Some people might recognize themselves. One of the responses that I've gotten to this book is, this is so contemporary. Everything these people are saying, it's things that I've heard. In some cases, it's things that I've thought, especially the well-intentioned characters might say things that we've thought. And I hope that by really getting inside the minds of some of these characters who came up with these truly terrible ideas that continue to affect us all today, I hope that people will notice the resonances in ourselves today. Some of the beliefs that we continue to hold today were planted in our minds in Auburn, New York, almost 200 years ago. And by actually hearing the words of people who came up with these ideas and created these practices 200 years ago, we can hear these ideas anew in our own minds, and we can start to expel them from ourselves.
That's a really important point. And I think, on a closing note, really, your book again kind of, ties the knot once again between racism, slavery, and the carceral system. And, all roads keep leading back to that place. And I think people have deluded themselves into thinking, oh, the only way we can deal with crime is to lock somebody in a cage. And prison abolitionists, and I'm not quite there, but I'm getting there, because I think for most people there are better ways than locking somebody in a cage. There are a few people that probably really do need to be locked up for the safety of society. But I think that number is exceedingly small.
Yeah, this book has moved me towards a prison abolitionist perspective. That's for sure. Realizing how much people in New York State in the 19th century believed that prison was inevitable, that it was the only possible way to have a society. And it wasn't true then, and maybe it's not true now.
Yeah. All right. Well, I really appreciate learning more about your book, Freeman's Challenge. Robin Bernstein, professor at Harvard, is the author. Highly recommend the book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.